On my 17th birthday, my parents pushed me out of the house so my pregnant sister's boyfriend could move into my room. I didn't complain or put up a fight. Instead, I quietly decided to. Hey Reddit, so on my 17th birthday my parents basically shoved me out the door to make space for my sister's boyfriend and their baby, and just when I thought I was finally free of them, I learned they weren't quite done with me yet, so let me rewind to where everything really began. My name's Hannah, and I woke up turning 17 this morning, living in a house that's just the four of us, me, my parents, and my older sister Lena, who's 23 and pregnant, and her boyfriend Mark, who's already pretty much taken over the place because my parents treat him like he belongs more than I do. I honestly figured they'd at least toss me a simple happy birthday, nothing fancy, just a word. But when I walked into the kitchen, all I heard was the low hum of the fridge while Dad sat behind his laptop and Mom scrolled her phone, with no cake or cheerful birthday greeting waiting for me. Then Dad cleared his throat and said, "Hannah, sit down for a minute," with that stiff, rehearsed tone that always means trouble, and after shutting his laptop he folded his hands like he was about to deliver some big speech. He told me that Mark had lost his apartment lease, and since Lena was due soon, they decided it made sense for the two of them to stay with us for a while, and before he even got to the point I was already waiting for the part where it became my problem. Mom jumped in and said they thought I should go stay at Aunt Carol's for a bit because I always liked it there. And I just blinked at them, asking what she meant by stay there. Dad looked straight at me and said it would only be for a few months because they needed the space and I was getting older, so apparently it was time for me to be independent, which was wild because I'm still in high school, and we actually have a guest room they could have used. When I pointed that out, Dad sighed like I was being dramatic and said Mark needed a real room and the guest room would become the baby's, so it supposedly all made sense to them. I just stared, saying, "So you're basically kicking me out for them?" And Mom tried to soften it by saying I'd be with family, but all I could think was, yeah, someone else's family. Dad's voice snapped sharper as he told me to stop being dramatic, and that they'd cover my expenses, but I just couldn't stay there right now, like tossing me out on my birthday was no big deal. That's when Lena wandered in half awake in an oversized hoodie asking what was going on, and Dad told her they were sending me to Carol's until the baby arrived. Her eyes got wide and she said she never asked for that, but Mom insisted it was easier this way because she needed peace and Mark needed space, and Lena just looked at me with this guilty expression right before Mark walked in behind her with that messy beard and smug grin that said more than he needed to. That was the last straw for me, so I shoved my chair back and said, "Fine, whatever, happy birthday to me," and went upstairs to pack even though I had no idea what I should bring. I grabbed some clothes, my console, my guitar, and a few notebooks, then looked at the crooked bookshelf I built last summer and realized they probably handed over to Mark, and when I spotted a cracked photo frame of me and Lena from some old carnival tucked under my desk, I tossed it into my bag without thinking. Downstairs the TV droned to no one and the washer buzzed like the house didn't even notice I was leaving, and Dad loaded my bags into the car like we were going on a casual weekend trip while Mom forced a smile and told me that Carol would love having me and to remember to thank her. The drive felt endless and silent, and while Dad tried to chat about school and my grades and even the weather, I just stared out the window watching my own reflection blur smaller each time we stopped at a red light. When we finally pulled up to Carol's little yellow house with potted plants everywhere, and that mix of detergent and fresh soil in the air, she opened the door smiling and wishing me a happy birthday, surprised that I was even there. Once my parents left, I heard Dad tell Mom, "See? That went fine." And Carol helped me carry my bags into the spare room that smelled like lavender and cardboard with a mismatched chair, a tiny desk, and a random poster of mountains. She told me to unpack and rest, and after she stepped out I sat on the bed staring at my lock screen, thinking about how I just turned 17 and had been kicked out by my own parents on my birthday. When their car disappeared down the street, the quiet hit hard until Carol showed up in the doorway with her hands on her hips and that kind smile hiding confusion as she asked if I was hungry, and even though I said no she went to make tea and told me to sit with her. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and lemon cleaner with a soft pop song playing on a little radio while she leaned on the counter watching me and said that my mom told her this whole thing was my idea, that I wanted space and independence. I froze and asked what she meant, and she explained my mom had texted yesterday saying I wanted to stay for a while, so I let out this short, bitter laugh because that wasn't even close to the truth. Carol frowned and asked me to explain, so I told her everything: the birthday morning, how they pushed me out so Mark could have a room, how Dad said I needed to grow up, and how even Lena didn't ask for any of it. Carol's whole expression shifted as I talked, her jaw tightening as her spoon clinked harder against her cup, And she finally said my mom made it sound like this was all my choice and she hadn't known I was showing up that morning. She muttered something under her breath, slid a mug toward me, and told me to drink because I wasn't going anywhere and we'd deal with this later. After dinner I finished unpacking in the spare room that smelled like clean laundry and old wood, with the wobbly chair, the flickering lamp, and a window looking out at a broken streetlight. I slid my clothes into the dresser and propped my guitar against the wall, and when I sat on the bed the frame let out a tired creak. I picked up my phone and checked it again, seeing the group chat blowing up with messages like, "Yo, where you at? And is it true your sister's guy is moving in?" But I didn't answer any of them and instead opened my photo gallery. The first picture staring back at me was from last summer with Mom, Dad, Lena, and Mark smiling at a barbecue, the same photo Dad had posted with the caption "Family Time," even though I was the one who took it and wasn't in it. I locked my phone and later called my friend Matt, and we joked around like usual until he suddenly asked if I was really living with my aunt now, and I told him that apparently it was something I supposedly wanted, which made him fall quiet for a second before saying, "That sucks, Hannah." After we hung up, I heard Aunt Carol outside my door, tapping once before pushing it open halfway and asking if I was okay, and I told her I was just talking to a friend. She leaned on the doorframe and said, almost to herself, that it was true then. They'd never asked me anything, not one single time. She sighed, crossed her arms and said, "All right, that's it," before heading to the kitchen to grab her phone, and I followed as she put the call on speaker. Dad answered after a few rings with that forced cheerful tone, and Carol cut straight to it, saying we needed to talk about what really happened. Dad tried to dodge it by saying things were complicated and they thought this was better for everyone. But she didn't let him finish, telling him he lied to her and used her to clean up their mess. Mom chimed in faintly telling her not to make it dramatic, but Carol stayed calm and sharp, saying kicking out their kid on her birthday and lying about it wasn't dramatic, it was disgusting. Then everything went silent and the call dropped. Carol set the phone down, still tense but steady, and said, "Well, guess that answers that," before looking at me with a softer expression and telling me I could stay as long as I needed and she didn't care what my parents said. I thanked her and she told me she had simple house rules: keep my stuff clean, don't stay out all night, finish school, and talk to her if something was wrong. And honestly, they were the first rules that ever felt reasonable. She went to bed early because of her morning shifts, and I stayed up with the window cracked open, breathing in air that smelled like rain mixed with someone's fresh laundry while distant pipes ticked and a dog barked somewhere down the street. I texted Matt my new address just in case, turned off the lamp, and lay down on sheets that smelled like detergent and something flowery, totally different from home, and for the first time in a long while I fell asleep without clenching my jaw or bracing my shoulders, not happy exactly but calm, like I was finally somewhere that didn't treat me like I didn't belong. 3 days passed since I'd moved in with Carol and school was fine, even quiet, but every night my mind replayed that morning in the kitchen with Dad telling me I was basically an adult, and it felt like a snapshot of being humiliated was just stuck in my head. That night I sat at the tiny desk in the spare room with the uneven lamp casting a shaky halo over the walls, my phone resting next to my guitar pick and a half-full mug, and without planning anything I opened the camera app and started talking. I said softly that I just turned 17 a few days earlier and my parents decided that meant I was ready to be on my own, telling me to move out on my birthday so my sister's boyfriend could have my room, and I let out this laugh that didn't sound like a real one. I said they claimed it was temporary, but I knew what that meant and that I was fine, I just needed to put it somewhere. I left out names or locations so Carol wouldn't get dragged in, and then remembered I'd hit my phone's voice memo button the moment that kitchen conversation started. Later I clipped one line from it, Mark saying, "Life's tough, man, she'll learn it," and added it quietly at the end before trimming the video. My little account barely had 30 followers from gaming servers, but I hit post anyway. At first nothing happened, then a notification popped up, then another, and by midnight I had about 50 likes and a dozen comments saying things like, "Same happened to me," and "Stay strong," and "You didn't deserve that." And even though I didn't respond, I read every single one because I wasn't used to strangers caring. When I woke up the next morning, the video had blown up, at least by my standards, with a few thousand views and random users arguing in the comments, and someone even wrote, "I hope your parents see this." And apparently it had been shared somewhere else. At breakfast, Carol asked if I was all right because I was quieter than usual, and I told her I didn't sleep much, and she nodded without pressing. Meanwhile, some side thread online was already trying to play detective with the busted streetlight in the background, tossing around cross streets like clues. Back in my room, I opened my phone and froze when I saw Mark's name because he'd commented on a repost, saying stuff like, "Some people love attention. Family issues shouldn't be aired online. She's being dramatic." But the replies underneath tore into him instantly. Someone recognized his profile picture from Lena's account and connected everything, and I just sat there half shocked and half laughing because he basically exposed himself trying to defend his ego. Then my phone started buzzing nonstop, Mom, Dad, and Lena all texting. "Take the video down. This is embarrassing. What did we ever do to deserve this? And Hannah, can we talk please?" I ignored all of them and walked into the living room where Carol was folding laundry, and she looked up when she saw my face and said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I showed her my phone and said it was kind of blowing up, and she just shrugged and said I hadn't said anything untrue. I told her they were mad, and she said calmly that they could be mad if they wanted, because they'd either get over it or they wouldn't, and all I did was tell my side. Back in my room I muted their numbers, and the second the silence hit, I felt relief spread through me. My phone kept buzzing with strangers leaving comments, and even though I didn't know most of them, a few messages stuck out saying things like, "My mom did the same," or "You're not alone," or "You're better off." And by that evening I wasn't checking the numbers anymore, just scrolling slowly, because it wasn't about going viral. It was the strange comfort of realizing I wasn't crazy or oversensitive the way Dad always made me feel. Around 2 in the morning I was still awake, lying on my side with my phone sitting on the nightstand while the blue glow from the screen made the walls look washed out and gloomy. A new message popped up from Lena saying, "Please just call me. I need to explain something." And I stared at it for a while without typing because I wasn't ready to hear anything from her. Then another message came through from an unknown number, and all I saw in the preview was the first line. "Mark, you think you're smart? You made things worse for everyone." And I blocked it before even opening it. When I finally set my phone down, the room went dark again except for the faint orange light leaking in from the street lamp outside. And I could hear the heater humming and some dog barking far away. It sank in that I'd changed everything with one short video, and I honestly didn't know if it was brave or stupid, but for once I didn't care what any of them thought. I flipped the phone face down, watching the dim reflection on the desk fade as the notifications stopped, and that was the first night I didn't feel replaced, just heard. By the next morning, everyone at school had watched the video, and I could tell from the way people looked at me, half curious, half sympathetic. A few gave me these small nods like they didn't know what to say, and I nodded back acting like it didn't get to me. Matt found me at my locker and said, "Dude, that thing's everywhere." My cousin saw it on her feed, and I just nodded because I already knew. He lowered his voice and asked if my parents were texting me, and I told him they wouldn't stop calling but I wasn't answering. Classes dragged by until the final bell, and when I walked outside with my backpack slung over one shoulder, I froze because my parents were standing by the main gate. Dad had his arms crossed, Mom clutched her phone like she'd been pacing, and even from a distance I could see they were angry. Matt noticed too and asked if I wanted him to stay, and I said yeah, just in case, and a couple of friends drifted over behind us without being asked. As soon as they saw me, my parents rushed forward. "Hannah," Dad called sharply, "we need to talk now." And I stopped and asked what he wanted. He glanced at my friends and said we shouldn't talk there and I should get in the car so we could talk privately, but I told him I wasn't getting in the car. Mom tried to sound calm, saying they weren't there to argue and just wanted to talk about the video because it had gotten out of hand, and I asked out of hand for who, me or them. She said quietly that I'd made my father look. Then Dad cut her off and said they came to fix this. I laughed once and told them they wanted to fix their image, not anything to do with me. Students were slowing down to watch and Dad noticed, lowering his voice as he told me I needed to come home so we could talk properly without everyone staring. I said they only cared because people found out and that they hadn't cared before, and he clenched his jaw and told me to watch my tone. Matt stepped closer beside me, and I repeated that I wasn't going anywhere because I lived with Aunt Carol now. Before either of them could reply, a voice asked behind us if everything was okay. It was Mr. Jacobs, the school counselor, who must have seen the whole thing from his window. Dad tried smiling and said everything was fine, just a family discussion. But Mr. Jacobs looked straight at me and asked if I was okay. I told him I was, but that I didn't want to go with them, and he nodded saying I didn't have to and that we could talk in his office if I wanted. Dad insisted that wasn't necessary, but Jacobs said it was my choice. Mom tried to smile and suggested we all talk together, but I said no. Jacob stayed close, watching, and Dad let out a frustrated sigh, saying I was making things harder than they needed to be, and to at least come home for one evening so we could talk like a family. I told him I already had a home, and they were the ones who made me leave the other one. Mom whispered that I was being cruel, and I said I'd been kicked out on my birthday. How was I the cruel one? She looked down, and Dad shifted since a few students were still lingering. He spoke quietly again, saying if I wanted to stay with Carol, fine, but the video had to come down because it was humiliating. I answered with a flat no, because it was the truth. He snapped my name like a warning, and I told him to stop pretending this was about me, because it was about them being embarrassed. The air felt heavy and even the traffic noise seemed to fade. Dad tried one more time, saying he just wanted 10 minutes in the car, but I stepped back and said I was done. Matt and my friends stayed behind me, silent but firm, and Mr. Jacobs came over again, saying he thought it was best for everyone to go their separate ways because I'd made my choice. Dad glared but didn't argue, muttered that I was making a mistake, and I told him maybe I was, but at least it was mine. They left without saying anything else. When they were gone, my knees felt weak, and Matt put a hand on my shoulder asking if I was okay. And I said yeah, even though that wasn't true. Mr. Jacobs asked if I wanted to come inside, and I nodded. In his office, he poured me a glass of water and told me I handled that better than most adults, and asked if he should call my aunt. I told him she was working and I'd text her later, and he nodded and said I had people there who would back me up. After he stepped out, I sat there for a minute staring at the wall that smelled like dry erase markers, with a crooked college flyer hanging on the bulletin board. When I walked out, the halls were empty and my hands were still shaking a little. Outside, Matt waited near the steps and didn't say anything, just walked with me, and for the first time I had told my parents no and actually meant it. It didn't feel like a victory, but it felt real. A week after everything at school, Carol told me we had an appointment to talk to someone about the situation, and I didn't ask who until we pulled up to this small building with a gold plaque that read, Mitchell and Horn Legal Services. Inside it smelled like paper and coffee, and a tall man with glasses shook Carol's hand and said, "Good morning, Miss Collins," then looked at me and said, "You must be Hannah." His office was tiny but stacked with books, and he talked for a while about guardianship, documentation, consent forms, and possibly transferring schools. Carol listened carefully, taking notes, and when he said they'd need proof of neglect or abandonment, my stomach tightened because that word, abandonment, felt dramatic even if it wasn't wrong. Carol pulled out a folder and handed it to him, and I saw texts from Dad printed out, screenshots, and even emails from Mr. Jacobs. She'd already gathered everything. The lawyer actually looked impressed and said, "You're organized. That'll help." And Carol gave this small, tight smile as she told him she wasn't about to let them mess things up again. I stayed mostly quiet, only answering what he directly asked: how long I'd been staying with her, whether I felt safe, how often my parents tried contacting me. When we wrapped up, he said that if my parents pushed back it could take a while, but keeping records was the right move. On the drive home I asked if she thought they'd fight it, and she kept her eyes straight ahead as she said that knowing my father probably, which was exactly why we were getting ahead of things. Back at the house, her phone buzzed nonstop and she handed it to me. Dad's messages were long rants about not turning this into a circus, saying family doesn't take each other to lawyers, accusing her of poisoning me against them. Mom's were shorter but just as desperate, asking why she was doing this, insisting I was still their daughter and she couldn't just take me. Carol scrolled through everything calmly, then took screenshots and emailed them to herself, saying she'd save it all and let them text as much as they wanted. I hesitated and said maybe I should go somewhere else until they cooled off, but she snapped firm and told me I wasn't moving again because I hadn't done anything wrong. Something about the way she said it hit hard, like she actually understood the difference between being a problem and being blamed for one. Later that night, after dinner, I got a text from Lena saying she hadn't known what happened on my birthday until someone sent her the video, and that she really needed to talk. I stared at it before replying and asked where, and she sent the name of a cafe downtown. Carol asked if I wanted her to come, but I told her no and that I'd text if anything weird happened. The cafe smelled like burnt espresso and vanilla syrup, and Lena was already sitting by the window looking exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and one hand resting on her stomach. She gave a faint smile and said hey, and I said hey back, and for a while neither of us talked. Then she said she didn't know they'd told me to leave that day because they told her I wanted to stay with Carol for school. I nodded and said they told her the same thing, and her eyes widened as she whispered, "They did." I said yeah, they lied to everyone. And she rubbed her forehead saying she should have known but believed them because they said she shouldn't stress, so she thought staying out of it would make things better. I told her she'd believed them her whole life. And after a second she nodded and said I was right. Then she admitted she hadn't been a good sister, that she let them treat me like I didn't matter because ignoring it felt safer. I stayed quiet and she finally said she was sorry, really sorry. I told her I didn't need a big apology, just honesty from now on, and she said she could do that. She added that she needed to figure out what she was doing with Mark because things were complicated, and I didn't ask anything because I already had a feeling. She asked if I was okay living with Carol, and I told her it was the first time I felt like someone actually wanted me there. And her eyes watered as she said good because I deserved that. We talked a little longer about the baby's school and how fast everything had fallen apart. And before we left she said she was scared I wouldn't meet her. I told her I almost didn't, and she gave a tiny sad smile and said fair enough. When I got home, Carol was at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and looked up when I walked in. I told her it went better than I expected and that Lena didn't know what they'd done. And Carol nodded, saying she figured as much and that my sister wasn't mean, just blind when it came to them. I sat down across from her while she stayed calm and focused, not angry, just steady in a way I'd never seen an adult be during a family disaster. Her phone buzzed again but she ignored it, saying to let them talk because we'd keep doing the right thing, and for the first time that actually sounded believable. Late Friday night my phone started buzzing while I was sitting on the couch next to Carol half watching some rerun as she sorted bills. The caller ID said Lena, and Carol looked over and asked if I was going to answer. I said yeah and swiped the screen. Lena's voice shook as she asked if I was busy, and when I said no she exhaled hard and told me she'd heard something from Mark and couldn't stop shaking. I stood and walked into the kitchen for privacy and asked what happened, and she hesitated before saying he'd been on a call with one of his friends and didn't know she was in the hallway, and he was laughing and bragging about how he'd convinced Mom and Dad to send me away so they could settle in before the baby came. My hand tightened around the edge of the counter as I said, "He what?" And she quietly repeated it, adding that he called me dead weight and said my parents agreed it was better to get me out early so there'd be less drama. I didn't know what to say for a few seconds before whispering that it wasn't even them, it was his idea, and she said he pushed for it and they just went along. I could hear her breathing fast, and then in the background Mark shouted something, probably asking who she was talking to. I asked if he was there right then and she whispered yes, saying he was furious because she confronted him, and he told her it wasn't a big deal because I would have moved out eventually anyway and he didn't think he'd done anything wrong. Then I heard his voice clearly louder, telling her to stop making a scene because I was fine and living like a king at my aunt's. I didn't say a word. I just listened as the call stayed live and the argument escalated. Lena snapped that he was disgusting for convincing her parents to kick her sister out just so he could have more space, and he actually laughed and said he was being practical because she was 8 months pregnant and I was a kid and I'd survive. Then there was this thud like a chair hitting the wall, and Lena shouted for him to get out and that she meant it. He asked if she was seriously throwing him out and she said yes now. I heard rustling and muttering and then a door slam. When everything went quiet she said he was gone. I didn't say anything at first, trying to catch up with what I just heard. She said he'd stuffed a few shirts into a duffel and texted my parents, and that by morning he was sleeping on their couch. Just until he finds a place, Mom had said, and of course my parents drove him everywhere after that. She let out a long breath and said, "You were right about him, Hannah. I should have seen it. He's selfish. He used every one of us." I told her she didn't need to explain because I'd already figured that out a while ago. She whispered that she was sorry for not believing me, for letting him treat me the way he did. I answered softly that it was okay, and that she needed to focus on herself and the baby because she didn't deserve the stress. "Neither did you," she said, and the line went quiet for a moment before she added that she was staying at a friend's place for the night and would figure everything else out later, but she wanted me to know what really happened. I told her I was glad she'd called, and she thanked me for picking up before hanging up. I stood there staring at the blank screen, my chest feeling tight. Not with anger, just heavy. When I walked back into the living room, Carol muted the TV and asked if everything was okay. I told her everything, word for word, and her face stayed neutral until I got to the part about Mark bragging. Then she shook her head and said some people really had no shame. She leaned back with her arms crossed and added that it was good Lena kicked him out, and maybe now she'd see my parents for who they really were. "Yeah," I said quietly. She stood up and patted my shoulder and asked if I wanted tea, and I nodded. While she filled the kettle, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Lena. It was a number I didn't recognize but somehow looked familiar. I answered carefully, and it was my grandfather. His voice was calm but serious as he said, "Hi, sweetheart. Your aunt told us a bit of what's going on. We wanted to hear from you directly." I swallowed and said it had been a lot, and then my grandmother's voice chimed in softly, apologizing because they hadn't known how bad things had gotten. I sat at the table and told them I was okay, staying with Carol, and that she'd been great. Grandpa said that was good because they were deeply disappointed in my parents. He explained they'd talked to them earlier, and it hadn't gone well. My heart sped up as he said they tried justifying everything but there was no excuse, and my grandparents told them they wouldn't hear from them again until they could treat me with basic respect. I didn't know what to say, so I just thanked them. Grandpa cleared his throat and told me to focus on school, and if I needed anything, books, clothes, money, I should tell Carol and they'd handle it so I wouldn't have to ask my parents. I mumbled that I appreciated it. Grandma added that I didn't need to answer any messages from my parents if they tried again, because I didn't owe them conversations. I told her I wasn't planning on responding anyway, and they both chuckled softly, trying to lighten the mood. Then Grandpa said they were proud of how I'd handled everything, that I'd shown more maturity than my parents had, and that one hit differently. I thanked them again and said good night. When I hung up, Carol set a mug of tea in front of me and asked if they'd called. I told her they talked to my parents and said they'd help with anything I needed, and she gave a faint smile and said good people stick around while the loud ones are just noise. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, and after she went to bed I washed the cup even though she'd told me to leave it. The warm water ran over my hands and echoed softly in the quiet house, and for the first time I wasn't thinking about Mark or my parents at all, just the steady sound of water. Carol's words drifted back to me, gentle but certain. I didn't have to earn basic kindness, and for once I believed her. 2 weeks after the call from my grandparents, it happened. It was a calm, sunny Saturday morning, and Carol was in the kitchen humming as she washed dishes while I sat in the living room finishing a school project. Suddenly, 3 heavy knocks slammed against the door, slow, spaced, like someone meant business. Carol turned off the faucet and looked at me, asking if I was expecting anyone, and I shook my head. She dried her hands and went to answer the door, and the second she opened it, her whole posture stiffened. My parents were on the porch. No Lena. A few steps behind them, leaning against their car with his arms crossed, was Mark, pretending not to listen. He'd been crashing at my parents' house ever since Lena threw him out, and apparently they all decided to pile into the same car like this was some sort of family outing. Mom spoke first, her voice shaky but angry, saying they needed to talk to their daughter. Carol didn't move from the doorway and told them to talk right there. Dad's jaw tightened as he said they weren't doing this on a porch and she should tell me to come outside. I stepped into the hallway where they could see me and said I could hear them just fine. Mom's eyes flicked toward me, softening just a little, and she asked if they could come in because this wasn't something to discuss in public. Carol stayed calm and said they could say whatever they needed to say right where they were. Dad snapped back that it wasn't her business and it was between them and their daughter, and she didn't flinch as she told him that the moment they dropped me off with her, it became her business. He exhaled sharply and turned back to me, saying they came because the video situation had gotten out of control. People at work knew, family refused to talk to them, and I needed to take it down. No, I said. He blinked like he didn't understand that answer and asked what I meant, and I repeated that it was staying up. Mom stepped forward and said I didn't understand how much damage it caused, that everyone thought they were terrible people. Carol cut in before I could say anything and told her they were terrible people for what they'd done, and that they didn't get to rewrite things just because the truth was out. Dad glared at her to stay out of it, and she crossed her arms and said that wasn't possible because I lived there now. He turned back to me, voice low and angry, and asked if I thought this was funny, making a fool out of my own family. I met his stare and told him he'd done that himself. I just told the truth. For a moment nobody said anything, and the tension felt thick and heavy. Mark shifted by the car pretending to check his phone but obviously listening. Mom's voice went soft and pleading as she asked me to come home for a little while until things settled down. We'll figure things out. It's what's best for everyone, Mom said, trying to soften her voice, but I just shook my head and told her they were the ones who said I couldn't stay there, so they didn't get to switch their stance now that things looked bad for them. Dad stepped forward, raising his voice again, insisting they were still my parents and that family sticks together. But Carol snapped back, sharper than before, that he didn't get to say that after kicking me out on my birthday. Dad's face flushed red as he growled that she didn't know everything, and she cut him off again, saying she knew enough. She knew they'd lied to her, dumped me on her porch with no warning, and told everyone I'd wanted it. That's all I need to know, she said. He just stared at her with his fists tightening and said she was turning me against them. She smirked and said he'd done that all on his own. Just then, Carol's phone buzzed on the table behind me. She checked it, smiled like she'd been waiting for the moment, and hit speaker. Grandpa's voice came through steady and loud as he asked if they were there. Dad froze and Grandpa continued, saying they already knew what was happening, and that I was staying exactly where I was, telling my parents to stop showing up unannounced and let me live in peace. Mom's face dropped and she begged, "Dad, please." But Grandpa shut her down fast, saying they'd had their chance and now Carol was handling things, and that they were proud of her for stepping up where my parents wouldn't. Carol gave me a tiny smile and thanked him, and then Grandma joined in, her voice gentle but sharp, saying to tell the young man outside that they knew exactly what he'd done and he wasn't welcome around their family. Out by the car, Mark instantly looked away and slipped into the driver's seat. Dad's voice cracked as he accused them of siding against their own children, but Grandpa stayed calm and said they weren't. He said they were standing up for the only one acting like an adult. After a few seconds of silence, Carol ended the call. Dad looked stunned, like he'd lost whatever script he had prepared. He rubbed his forehead and muttered that I'd regret all this one day, and I stood still as I told him I already regretted wasting so many years trying to make him happy. That was the end of it. He turned, waved Mom after him and started down the steps. She gave me one last look, a mix of guilt and anger, before following him. Mark tried to look tough as he started the car but misjudged the curb, scraping the door against it with a loud metallic thunk, and Carol let out a quiet laugh as they sped off. When the engine noise faded, she shut the door and locked it, then looked at me and said, "You did good, kid." I told her I didn't really do much, and she said that was the point. Sometimes standing still says more than shouting. That week the lawyer called to say my parents hadn't filed any objection, so the court granted Carol temporary guardianship. It happened quickly, but it covered school and doctors, and we'd handle the long-term order later. She was officially my guardian, and she teased me about not leaving dirty dishes around now that she legally owned me on paper. A few weeks later, Lena showed up holding the baby, tiny and wrapped in a yellow blanket with that mix of formula and baby powder hanging in the air. We sat at the kitchen table while Carol made tea. The baby hiccuped loudly and Lena burst into laughter, real laughter, the first I'd seen from her in months, and she told me I was going to be the best aunt. I told her I'd try because he deserved better than what we had growing up, and she whispered that he would. When they left, the house felt peaceful again. The kettle clicked, the heater hummed, and faint traffic noise drifted in through the window. I sat at my desk, pulled out my phone, and recorded a short video. Not emotional, just honest. I said sometimes family isn't who raises you, but who stands beside you when everyone else disappears, and that you should choose those people. I didn't care if it went viral, I just needed it said. Later that night I sat on my bed and glanced around the small room. The same cheap desk lamp, the faint hum of the streetlight outside, the soft detergent smell in the air. I didn't miss the old house. I missed the idea of what I thought a family should have been. But I wasn't lost anymore. I was home. YouTube's got this new hype feature, and if you're hooked on this story, hit that hype button because it tells the algorithm this video deserves some love and helps keep wilder stories coming your way. And if you've ever been made to feel like you were the problem just for wanting respect, if anyone's ever called you ungrateful for asking to be treated fairly, hear me out. You're not wrong for setting boundaries. You're not cruel for protecting your peace. You're not heartless for walking away from people who keep hurting you. Sometimes choosing yourself is the only way you make it through. For years I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought keeping the peace meant staying quiet. I thought being the good daughter meant swallowing every insult, every guilt trip, every dismissal just so nobody else got uncomfortable. But real love doesn't demand silence, and real family doesn't threaten you for saying no. Looking back now, I see something simple but powerful. What I lost wasn't family, it was control dressed up like love. And what I gained was freedom. Freedom to breathe without asking permission. Freedom to decide who I want to become. Freedom to build a life that doesn't revolve around pleasing people who never tried to understand me. I still get messages from strangers, kids my age, adults twice my age, saying the same thing happened to them, and it breaks my heart but reminds me I'm not alone, and neither are they. Carol always says the best revenge is peace, and maybe she's right. Peace is quiet, steady, and it doesn't need to prove anything. Now when I walk into that little yellow house after school with its smell of lemon cleaner and lavender, I don't feel like a guest. I feel like I belong. There's laughter in the kitchen. The sunlight feels warm, not heavy. And when I close my door at night, it doesn't sound like goodbye anymore. It sounds like home. So yeah, my parents might keep telling people I was rebellious or that someone filled my head with ideas. Let them talk. The truth is simple. They kicked me out to make space for someone who didn't deserve it, and I made space in my life for people who did. That's not rebellion, that's healing. And if you've ever been where I was, if you've ever been the one pushed aside, written off, or replaced, hear this: you don't need their permission to start over, and you don't need their apology to move forward. You don't need to keep proving your worth to people who only see your usefulness. You just need one safe place, one person who believes you, one moment where you finally decide you've had enough. That moment is when everything changes. Because when you stop begging people to love you the right way, you finally start learning to love yourself the way you always should have. And honestly, that's what saved me.